Hello. Today we're going to be reading Introduction to Dialectical Materialism, the Marxist Worldview by August Thalheimer. Written in 1927. Source is August Thalheimer, Introduction to Historical Materialism, the Marxist Worldview. Convici Freire, 1935. Online version is the Marxist Internet Archive, which is what I'm using to read this, 2004. Transcription is by Edward Crawford. Markup is by Matthias Bismo. Without further ado, let's get to the preface to the German edition. The following lectures, under the title of, quote, The Modern Worldview, unquote, were delivered in Moscow in the spring of 1927 before second-term students of the Sun Yat-sen University. They were delivered in German, and every paragraph or section was followed by a translation into Chinese. The brevity of the individual lectures is ascribable to this devious method of presentation, which at times limited a single lecture to 3/4 of an hour, and necessarily made them extremely concise. At the same time, the need for translation demanded the simplest possible style. Moreover, the presentation had to be as elementary as possible because of the great differences in education among my Chinese listeners, differences between those who had been students in Europe and the young workers. Especially in European history and literature, was there much that could not be taken for granted, although, of course, one could assume a great deal of knowledge of Chinese history and literature which is not part of the average European education. Since the course had to be completed within a comparatively short time, a systematic and exhaustive treatment was impossible. It had to be limited to those fundamental theoretic concepts which were most important to the given audience. The purpose of the lectures was to help the Chinese listeners, as well as possible Chinese readers, towards an independent orientation to the principal philosophic worldviews which impinged upon them. For this reason, the historical form of presentation was chosen. It also accounts for the review of ancient Indian and Chinese philosophy, as well as pragmatism. Unfortunately, sufficient source material for a contemplated treatment for the currents in modern Chinese philosophy was not available. The lectures were stenographically recorded and only slightly edited, and they remain essentially as given. It was therefore further intended to add to the small number of literary quotations contained in the lectures. Instead, however, marginal notes were placed beside each paragraph or section to help the reader's perspective. Note 1. As a matter of convenience, these marginal notes in the German text have in large measure been used in the analytical table of contents in the English edition rather than were originally intended. Back to the text. The author hopes that the lectures will also be of use to European readers who wish to be introduced to dialectical materialism. He refers above all to young revolutionary workers. The readers trained in Marxism will notice that a number of themes are treated here either for the first time or in new connections. Some of these are ancient dialectics, ancient Indian and Chinese philosophy, and the development of the inner connections between the main propositions of materialist dialectics. I shall be pleased if the ideas sketched here inspired further detailed Marxist research. August Thalheimer, Moscow, June 1927. Preface to the American edition. For details about the origin of this book, which reproduces a series of lectures, the reader is referred to the preface of the German edition, reprinted here. The book has appeared in Russian, Japanese, and Spanish, as well as in German. The original German edition has long been out of print. Owners of copies in Germany have to conceal them carefully from the eyes of the Gestapo, the government's secret police. Consequently, the translators had considerably difficulty hunting out an extra German copy. For American readers, the following comments may be in order. The book is meant for readers who have no special philosophic training, but who are connected with the labor movement. That is, it is meant primarily for workers. In virtue of their class position and their class experience, much of its content will be clearer to them than to bourgeois intellectuals, who, though they may indeed be practiced in abstract thought, will approach the subject with their peculiar class prejudices, with deep-rooted habits of thought, and with traditional academic concepts. I have taken pains to present the subject in the simplest possible language and to relate it as much as possible to everyday experience. But let no one therefore be misled into thinking that the subject itself is "simple" or "commonplace." The fruits of more than 2,000 years of painstaking and involved intellectual labor are contained in materialist dialectics, a labor shared by many peoples. The readers may rest assured that it is much easier to present the subject in a traditional philosophic language. For students this might have certain superficial advantages, but it would not make the problem itself any easier, nor would it help the workers, who constituted the main contingent of my European readers, and whom I chiefly wish to address here in America as well. Usually, when confronted with an introduction to a science, one assumes that the science itself already exists in elaborate, systematic form, in formal texts. But this does not apply to materialist dialectics, and it can be safely said that it will still be some time before there will be a text for materialist dialectics as systematic and complete as Hegel's logic is for idealistic dialectics, or as many texts on formal logic. To make way for such a text, a tremendous amount of preliminary labor is necessary. Among other things, the critical examination of all materials in the history of philosophy as sources. Readers who wish to go more deeply into this subject should refer to the works of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Plotnikov, Laborda, Franz Mehring, and Lenin, who treat of the problems of philosophy and the history of philosophy. And if they wish to go further and make independent investigations in the field of materialist dialectics, they should, on the basis of the groundwork thus laid, make a critical study of the principal works of philosophy and the principal contributions of modern natural science, as well as the Marxist social sciences. Readers who have neither the opportunities nor the inclination for this sort of study, and these will doubtless be in the majority, are advised that conscious participation in the struggles of our time, which is uncommonly full of sudden crises and sharp contradictions, will provide more than enough material for a deeper understanding of the fundamental concepts and methods of materialist dialectics. Such participation can make these principles and methods a vital part of oneself, an instrument of thought for daily use, i.e., it can teach one to think dialectically. This book is not meant for casual spectators, nor is it meant for those who are or wish to be academic philosophers. It is intended primarily as a tool for practical and conscious participants in the class struggle of today. Perhaps it may also be of some service to natural scientists who wish to become acquainted with unbiased methods of thought which depart from tradition but which are closely related to the "instinctive" materialism of natural science practice. August Thalheimer, Paris, December 1935. Chapter 1, Religion 1. Religion 1. Our topic is the "modern worldview." Immediately, this question arises. Is there a uniform modern worldview accepted by everyone, in the sense that there is a uniform physics or chemistry? Physics and chemistry are unquestionably uniform systems which one can expound in the same way all over the world. Of course, in these sciences, too, there are moot questions, but these moot questions remain within the bounds of the science. They only arise upon a common basis of accepted scientific achievement, and they are settled by methods which are accepted by all concerned, that is, by experiments. This is true of such problems as arise in physics, those, for example, in relation to the theory of relativity. Thus, there is the important and very much discussed question whether there is an ether or a material medium of light. Now, in physics, we answer such questions by experiments, and this problem was actually tackled by a series of experiments by famous physicists, particularly by the American physicist Michelson. Then there are a whole series of other problems which arise in this connection, such as the question of apparent irregularities in the orbit of the planet Mercury, the question of the path of a ray of light which passes close to the sun, etc. For all these questions in physics, there is a uniform method of research, a uniform solution. The same is true of problems in chemistry. Recently, for example, the question arose whether it was possible to change lead or quicksilver into gold. Several investigators maintained that it could be done, but it was demonstrated through more exact experiments that, for the present, it cannot be done. Or other problems of chemistry. The problem of the composition of the ultimate chemical elements, atoms. Here too experiment has led to further disclosures and to uniform solutions. Atoms have been finally analyzed into smaller elements. Therefore, all things considered, we can say that there are a number of sciences which are uniform, which one can uniformly expound, and which are determined by uniform methods. And the case is quite different with questions of worldview. There is no uniform, universally accepted modern worldview, as there is a uniform physics or a uniform chemistry or botany. There are, as we know, wholly opposed worldviews which wage violent war on each other, which do not accept each other's methods. What is true for one in philosophy is false for the others. What is false for one is true for the others. For instance, I am a communist, and as a communist represent a very definite viewpoint, namely historical or dialectical materialism. But this worldview coexists with other opposing it which also call themselves "modern," and which wage violent war on dialectical materialism, while at the same time dialectical materialism wages violent war on them. Moreover, there is a further consideration. You see on the one hand that this theory of historical materialism is uniform. Wherever it is presented in the same manner. When a dialectical materialist deals with certain questions, he treats them in the same way as another dialectical materialist. One more skillfully, the other less skillfully. One with more, the other with less knowledge of the facts. But the method is one and the same. But consider on the other hand, the worldviews which stand opposed to historical materialism. Here are a whole host of different viewpoints on nature and on history. To begin with, there are a great number of worldviews which we call religion. Religion is a definite worldview, as you know. There is not one but a great number of religions, each of which maintains that it alone is right, and that all others are wrong, and that letters spacing. It alone points out to men the right path in life and the way to a happy life after death. That it alone delivers men from all evil and suffering. Besides these different religions, there are various other worldviews of a philosophical nature. Such conceptions are well nigh as numerous as professors of philosophy. There are a whole host of schools of philosophy in America and Europe, and depending upon where you go, you will be told that one or another is the philosophy. Here the case is the same as with religions. Each maintains that it alone is right and that all the others are wrong. Such worldviews occur in great number not only in America and Europe. As you know, there are also in China a whole host of philosophic systems which war with each other, which compete with each other for your attention. The question therefore arises, how shall we correctly orient ourselves in this difficult situation? How shall we solve the problem of describing the modern worldview without causing a hullabaloo in our minds? Since I accept a definite modern worldview, dialectical materialism, the impression might be received that this will be a one-sided report. Perhaps someone might propose that we seek to get a cross-section of all the different viewpoints and possibly find therein what is common to all and present it as the quote-unquote the modern worldview. But these viewpoints so contradict each other, they set out from such different premises and employ methods so different that if I contrived to put them all together into one lump and then pared away the contradictions, there would be nothing left. The problem becomes all the more difficult since you who read these lectures are not possessed of blank minds. Rather, each one of you already holds this or that worldview more or less clearly, either as a result of insulated religious attitudes or as a result of other environmental influences, language, lectures, books, etc. Thus, I cannot assume, rather, each one of you, that you will receive what I shall say about modern worldviews without prejudice. Consequently, I shall approach the problem in the following manner. I shall present dialectical materialism as the most advanced modern worldview, yet not simply as something ready-made, but in its historical setting, in its development. I shall therefore try to show how, from what sources, historical materialism came into being. Secondly, from the standpoint of historical materialism, I shall try together with you to come to an understanding of the most important and influential worldviews in Europe, America, and China, which coexist with historical materialism, so that we may confute or even accept them, supplement, or improve them. I chose this type of presentation to help you arrive at an independent orientation and to help you find your way among the various intellectual currents which will sooner or later confront you. I consider best the method used by the famous German philosopher Kant. He used to say to his listeners, I do not want to teach you philosophy, that is, a hard and fast doctrine, but I wish to teach you how man philosophizes, how man will gain little, how man orients himself in relation to nature and history. It is the same with philosophy as with a craft, shoemaking, let us say. If I discuss shoemaking, it will be of little value if I do not show how the thing is practically handled. Likewise, you will gain little if I speak at great length on dialectical materialism, but fail to point out how man applies this worldview to the fundamental problems of social theory, history, natural science, epistemology, etc., so that he may consistently elaborate and solve them. Therefore, in my presentation of historical or dialectical materialism, I shall apply the method of historical materialism itself. Through this procedure, you will become acquainted with two special characteristics of dialectical materialism at the same time. I present dialectical materialism itself as something which comes into being, that is, as something historical. It is a peculiar quality of historical materialism that it views all things in both natural and human worlds, nor as completed, not as finished once and for all, but as emerging, continually changing, and ultimately disappearing. And secondly, when I show you how historical materialism emerged from a worldview or from various worldviews which were directly opposed to it, you will see here a special kind of dialectical materialism. You will perceive that development comes about through contradictions, that a thing always develops out of its opposite. This proposition demands detailed clarification and foundation, which it will receive later. What obtains for all things also obtains for historical materialism itself, and this we shall have to show. When we consider at closer range the different worldviews which today stand opposed to each other, we can distinguish beneath apparent confusion very definite groupings, very definite categories. When we examine them from this point of view, we find two fundamental tendencies. These two tendencies of the modern worldview are in close correspondence with the underlying class division which is characteristic of modern capitalistic society. Just as the working class and the bourgeoisie stand opposed to each other, so we see that the modern worldviews are grouped in accordance with these fundamental tendencies. One tendency is the proletarian. To it belongs historical or dialectical materialism, otherwise known as Marxism. The other is the bourgeois tendency, which is represented by the different forms of the so-called idealistic worldview. These two fundamental tendencies are as definitive of the worldviews as difference between the two classes is definitive of social life and economics. In addition, there is still a third tendency, which stands apparently between the two, between the proletarian and the bourgeois, and which fancies itself as standing above the other two tendencies, but which is really only a special form of the bourgeois outlook. This type of worldview corresponds to that class which stands between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, namely the petty bourgeoisie. Just as the petty bourgeoisie stands socially between proletariat and bourgeoisie, so there is a series of worldviews which stand between the materialist tendency of the proletariat and the idealistic tendency of the bourgeoisie. But just as the petty bourgeoisie cannot in actuality assume a neutral, intermediate position between proletariat and bourgeoisie, but must decide in favor of one or the other class, it must form an alliance with one or with the other. So the worldviews of the petty bourgeoisie cannot stand above or between materialism and idealism. All of these viewpoints are actually varieties of the idealistic or bourgeois tendency. In what follows, I shall try to present these fundamental tendencies and their historical development. Accordingly, we need not to treat them in very great detail, listing many names, dates, etc., but we need only make the basic concepts as clear and distinct as possible. From the standpoint of China, only the great lines of European cultural history are of importance. I want to tell you briefly what I shall mainly deal with as regards the prehistory and later development of historical materialism and the views opposed to it. Of course, dialectical materialism itself will be the focal point. First, one shall deal with the question of religion as the oldest and fundamental conception from which all the others have emerged. Then I shall deal with the most important worldviews as they were developed in antiquity, in ancient Greece, in India, and in China. Again, not in detail, but only in broad and general outline. Then I shall enter upon a treatment of French materialism, that is, the worldview which prepared the way for the greatest and most significant bourgeois revolution at the end of the 18th century. I shall treat French materialism separately because of its essential contribution to the development of historical materialism. Then I shall present the most important stages in the development of classical bourgeois philosophy in Germany, Hegel and Verbach. I single out these two because, like the French materialists, they made a surpassing contribution to the building of the modern dialectical viewpoint. Finally, when we have viewed the history of dialectical materialism in its principal phases, we shall seek to orient ourselves in relation to the most important intellectual currents of the present day in America, in Europe, and in China. We may now turn immediately to our first topic, a consideration of religions. We begin with religion because religion, as you know, is the oldest of all worldviews. I shall not deal with the different forms of religion in different countries and ages. That would have no value for us. Rather, I am going to deal only with that which is universal and fundamental in religion. I shall take up the question in what fundamental way it differs from the modern worldview, how religion emerges, what material basis it has, how religion becomes separated from science and finally disintegrates, and what particular stand communism takes on the question of religion. The first question: what distinguishes religion from the modern scientific dialectical materialistic worldview? What is the peculiar essential characteristic of religion? The essential characteristic of religion I can designate thus. Religion is a product of fantasy, of the imagination, as opposed to the modern worldview, which is a product of science. Or it may also be contrasted thus. Religion is rooted in belief, science, and knowledge. But it is not true that religion, as opposed to science, is solely a product of free fantasy, that it comes into being without previous experience. The case is just the same with religious fantasy as it is with every other fantasy. Every fantasy, all poetry, has a distinct empirical basis, which is elaborated in a fantastic way. Science likewise has its empirical basis, but it elaborates in a manner diametrically opposite to religion, not through fantasy but through logic, through research and through reason. In order to present this contrast as simply as possible, I want to give you an example of how one and the same event is treated by religion and by science. Let us take a phenomenon like rain. Rain is a phenomenon of extraordinary importance to the material life of mankind. Among peoples whose principal occupation is agriculture, the fate of the population is in large measure dependent upon the frequency, quantity, and local distribution of rain. But rain is a phenomenon which lies outside man's control. Man cannot cause it to come and go as he pleases. What then does religion do? What do primitive peoples do? They represent the natural phenomenon of rain as the product of a fantastic being of a god of rain. Such rain gods are found among primitive folk in highly varying forms. The problem then is to influence these lords of rain by those methods known through experience to exert an influence on mighty beings. These are gifts or sacrifices, supplications, prayers, threats, or symbolic acts which are supposed to represent real acts, ceremonies. Among some peoples we find specialists for this purpose, so-called rainmakers, who believe that they can conjure up rain through ceremonies, incantations, etc. Science views rain quite differently. It considers it not as the product of a god, spirit, or demon, but as the product of natural causes, of given natural forces. It seeks the cause of rain not in the arbitrary will of fantastic beings which are supposed to be hidden behind the phenomenon, but in the phenomenon itself and in its relation to the general organization of nature. Thus there is a special science, meteorology, which deals with rain, observes its manifestations, and arranges these observations with special reference to the question: what is the cause and what is the effect? Under what conditions does rain fail to appear? In what religions does it appear, etc.? We are not yet so far advanced in the science that we can always predict exactly the occurrence of rain, nor can we produce it at will. Thus, an Australian rain magician is apparently much farther advanced than a modern student of meteorology, who predicts rain more or less exactly, but cannot produce it. You see here the fundamental contrast between the method of religion and that of science. A second very well-known example, the remarkable phenomenon of thunder, on which everyone reflects. The religious person conceives that there is a god of thunder, who travels over the clouds in a chariot, or who brings forth the tumult with an instrument. He has various magical means by which he believes he can make thunder. Science, as we know, treats thunder very differently, namely as a noise which is bound up with the occurrence of an electric discharge, lightning. We are not yet so far advanced that we can actually bring forth thunder and lightning on a large scale, but on a small scale in the laboratory, we can already produce effects identical with thunder and lightning. To sum up what we have learned from these examples, the peculiar characteristic of religion is that it fantastically elaborates a certain cycle of experiences, they nature, or in history, and in such fashion that gods, spirits, or demons are represented as the producers, lords, or masters of natural phenomena. In the most developed forms of religion, there are not many spirits, gods, or demons, but only one God, who is the supreme ruler of nature, a fantastic being who is supposed to sit above and beyond the world, whose nature can be recognized as the projection of man himself, whose capacities are fantastically elevated, and who has these capacities without a body appertaining. Perhaps we should not say that there is one God, but rather that there is a ruling family, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who together rule the world. From the elementary form which this assumes with the Australian Negro to the form which it takes in the Christian religion, there is a long chain of development, but in fundamental principle it is the same throughout. Today, under modern capitalism, there are, to be sure, extraordinary refined forms in which the religious idea is far removed from the primitive conception of rain god held by the Australian natives. If Eve probed deeply, however, we discover that these very refined conceptions hark back to the mystical beings of primitive people, who arbitrarily controlled events. Quite different is the method of science. What does science do? It observes and collects facts. It arranges them in groups, classes, etc. It analyzes them, seeks rules as to how the consequences derived from the precedent facts, how concomitants mutually affect each other, how the facts occurred. It investigates, and this is very important, how social forms come into being and how they change. And moreover, on the basis of natural science, it builds technology, and on the basis of social science, politics. Thus, in accordance with known laws, it places the forces of nature at the service of human ends, at the service of the establishment of use values, or social institutions. In this respect, religion, no matter what name it may bear, fundamentally differs from modern science, from the modern worldview. I proceed now to my next topic, namely to the question, what are the main sources of religious conceptions? We can distinguish two main sources from which religious conceptions flow. The first source is the relation of man to nature. His dependence, in fact, upon nature and his desire to master in fantasy the forces of nature, which he cannot master in reality, by offering sacrifices, praying, performing ceremonies, etc. The second and no less important source from which religious conceptions and religious fantasies flow are the relations of individual men to society, that is to say, the totality of social relations. Now, the basis of social relations, in turn, is the mode of production, i.e., the relationships into which men enter with each other while producing, with certain instruments, useful things for the maintenance of life, or the social way in which they produce their material livelihood. We shall now consider these two sources of religion. First of all, in the most primitive social forms. As for dependence upon nature, it is clear that the less developed men are, technically and economically, so much more dependent are they upon nature, and they are more inclined to view all natural phenomena through the eyes of religious fantasy. If you consider primitive man and armed with only the most elementary implements of stone, bone, or wood, scarcely able to sustain life by hunting, fishing, etc., it is clear that from such relations of dependence upon nature the most varied religious ideas must develop. Or take the primitive farmer. He is extremely dependent upon the forces of nature, on the sun, the wind, the rain, on the river which flows past his land. As long as man is style, letter spacing, unable to supervise all these relations, to foresee them, and conquer them technically to a certain degree, he will seek mastery over these things through religious ideas. In this connection, I want to remind you of the distinctive characteristics of the ancient religion of China, which naturally is a religion of farmers. In it, the forces of nature which are most important for the farmer, such as rain, the heavens, the stars, etc., play a decisive role in the religious idea. If you consider the different social forms and their religions, you will find that they always stand in exceedingly close connection with the way in which such a society stands in relation to nature. I do not wish to go into further detail on this question, but simply to indicate the general aspect of the matter. The second source from which the religious idea flows is the social relations of man with each other. These social relations show that the individual man in society is dependent upon the whole, that over against him a higher power is placed. In early times, the society as a whole exercised a very powerful influence upon the individual, and the subordination of the individual to the family and to the tribe was extraordinarily great. For the individual moral laws, customs, usages, and precepts of universal scope had the force of imperative commands, but their meaning and purpose were not generally, not even in the majority of instances, clear to the individual or understood by him. Conformity was instinctive, automatic. Primitive society was itself still a kind of natural organism, its codes, precepts, customs, etc. Affected individuals just like the uncomprehended forces of nature. Indeed, primitive social organization, in general, reacted to their own regulations as they did to mutable forces of nature. And from this characteristic of social organization, there naturally arose the religious idea as its support and sanction. For example, everywhere in the South Seas we have the so-called taboo commandments, that is, commandments which declare that such and such groups of men must not hunt and eat such and such animals at certain times, or not collect and eat certain plants. Such commandments once had a distinct significance. They were equivalent to the regulation of production. They affected a kind of division of labor and a kind of regulation of consumption. But these commandments later became obscure, became automatic. From them certain religious commandments developed, to the effect that such and such spirits, demons, etc., had issued such and such commandments, and would see to their observance by dread of punishment. Still, another example that comes very close to home, one of the oldest perhaps, the oldest religious idea is that of reverence for the souls of the dead, the spirits of the ancestors. Even in the most primitive religious ideas, these plays a very important role. The spirit of the ancestors cannot be explained as the personification of a natural phenomenon, but they can easily be explained in terms of social relations. The souls of the dead, which are revered by their descendants, preserve the continuity in the imagination, of course, between the ancestors and descendants. They assure the continuous recognition of the traditional social order. The ancestral spirit of the family or the tribe personifies its order. Especially potent sources of religious ideas developed when class conflicts came to the fore, for then religious ideas became a mean through which the ruling class holds the exploited and oppressed class in obedience and subjugation. Moreover, as soon as class conflicts arise in the course of the social division of labor, there emerges a distinct class or caste which specializes in religious matters, namely the priests. This class is more or less freed from direct productive labor, and lives upon the surplus product of the others. For this priestly caste, religious ideas becomes a means by which to support and preserve their privileged status in society. We must not think of this matter as if it were sheer imposture. On the contrary, this class or caste, like their ideas, grew out of social and natural relations. Hence they became just as widely accepted by the mass of people as by the priests. They constituted a worldview adapted to primitive relationships and to primitive methods of thought. As a dialectical materialist, one must recognize that for a certain limited period, this priesthood played a progressive role. In a time when men had to exert themselves to the utmost to produce even the barest essentials of life, the priests represented a social stratum which did not directly participate in labor, and therefore could occupy themselves with a number of socially important problems for which this very freedom from directly productive labor was prerequisite. Thus it was the priests who first developed the elements of science. The beginnings of astronomy can be traced back to the Egyptian and Babylonian priests. The first elements of geometry were discovered by priests. They discovered how to measure land. They developed the ground plan for constructing temples. They predicted the rise and fall of the waters of the Nile, etc. Their priestly caste developed the seeds, which in the form of philosophy and natural science finally put an end to all the priests and all religion. Chapter 2, Religion 2. In the last chapter, we dealt with the nature and sources of religion, and subsequently with the roots of religion in early society. We came to the conclusion that even in primitive society, there existed two basic roots of the religious viewpoint. One, the dependence of society upon nature, the other, social life itself. Now we shall go further, and I shall try to point out the connection between the development of religion on the one hand and the development of the mode of production and the form of society on the other. I cannot, of course, go into great detail on this question. Its history is indeed very interesting and very full, but I can give only the very general fundamentals. I should like, first of all, to point out the extremely close relation in ancient times between the development of ideas concerning the gods and the development of social forms, social organization. Let us take a very widespread phenomenon, such as the community of the various local and tribal gods. Just as individual families in primitive times are joined to tribes and individual tribes are themselves joined to the groups of tribes and peoples, so also we see that the primitive village and familial gods are joined to the tribal gods, from whose number is chosen the highest god or a given tribe. When the different tribes are then joined into a nation and to a people, a national god emerges. Finally, when we get a still greater entity, an empire, which consists of different nations, you find that above the level of national gods, an imperial god is created. This is especially evident in ancient China, where the organization of gods, etc., corresponds exactly to the social organization. First, we have the family and clan spirits, the ancestors. In a wider sphere, we have the village and the local spirits or deities. Then we have the deities of cities and of provinces. Finally, as China developed from very small feudal states into a centralized monarchy, we likewise get a centralization of gods. Quote-unquote heaven emerges as the highest divine power, and the high priest of heaven is, of course, the emperor. Correspondingly, in the Western world, in the Roman Empire, we see how Christianity develops as a world religion out of the primitive tribal and national religions. The starting point for the Christian world religion was the national religion of the small nation of Palestine, the Jews. The Jewish national god expanded into a world god. This Jewish national god was highly suited to be the starting point for an international world god of ancient times, since he was the god of an oppressed national people, and the oppressed classes and peoples of the Roman Empire naturally became the first bearers of this new world religion. A few more words concerning Christianity and its introduction. Not only is the connection of Christianity with the structure of society manifested into the character of God as the world God, but the connection is evident in still another very significant respect. Christianity first appeared as the religion of slaves. The slaves, as the most harshly exploited and oppressed class of the population, had the greatest need for deliverance. The slaves were brought to Rome from all over the world. The common oppression and the common life they shared effaced their national differences. They were predisposed to an international religion of deliverance, to a world religion. One may ask why this religious need became especially marked among the slaves and why they did not become materialists or atheists. In order to understand this, we must realize that a class can only shake off religion completely when it has the power and capacity to construct a new world, a higher economic and social order, when in short it can deliver itself. This was not the case among the slave of antiquity. From slavery there lies no direct path to a higher economic and social order. Slavery led to the decline of the ancient world, the world of Greek and Roman culture. A new development did not set in until the German tribes invaded the Roman Empire, destroyed the old social order and culture, and built up feudalism. The slave system as such offers no historical way out. Thus, the ideology of the slaves rebelling against their destiny was bound to become a religion, Christianity. The emancipation was bound to assume a fantastic form, an empire ruled by a world savior with a communistic consumption economy. This empire was first located in this world, then in the next, in quote, heaven. Quote, I should like to add that among modern slaves there exists naturally and necessarily an especially strong Christian religious feeling, for example, in the cotton plantations of the southern states of the United States. This is a reaction against the terrible oppression which they suffered, from which they saw no way out through their own powers. The same connection between the social order and religious ideas we see again in the feudal Middle Ages. The religion of the feudal Middle Ages is only apparently the same as the religion of declining antiquity, but actually Christianity changed in the Middle Ages, just as social relations changed. In place of the Roman world empire, there appears in the Middle Ages a system of feudal states. The forerunners of modern European national states are developed. Local economic ties become closer. We are immediately struck by the fact that, whereas Christianity expressly recognized only one divinity in the form of three beings, the medieval picture becomes much more complicated and heavenly beings are arranged like feudal society itself. In the Middle Ages, we have an organization of divinities, which corresponds exactly to the organization of ruling classes on earth. The organization of the feudal order is about as follows. There is first the single feudal landholder, who is the vassal of an earl or a duke. These dukes are further organized under a sovereign. Over the sovereign, princes, dukes, kings, or whatever they may be called, is a supreme ruler. The emperor. The gods and saints in the Middle Ages are organized in the same way. First we have the village, with its village saints. Then the individual provinces with their special saints, and individual nations, Germany, France, England, with their national saints. The organization extends to heaven itself. There we have the angels in various ranks, the archangels and the Holy Trinity constituting the all highest. We have exactly the same feudal organization in hell, in the underworld. This feudal conception of Christianity has been portrayed by a great poet of the European Middle Ages, the Italian poet Dante, who lived in the 13th century. He portrayed the hierarchy of heaven and of hell in classic fashion. We further see that in the feudal Middle Ages, even the most primitive religious ideas have not died out. Ideas dating from pagan times about ghosts, dwarfs, and giants still persist. All these different demons, spirits, etc., populate the world of Christianity. They, too, have their roots in the vital relations of medieval society. Now to turn to the sources and role of religion in modern capitalistic society. One might at first believe that religion today no longer has any basis in capitalistic society, since this society's relation to nature is entirely different from that of all previous societies. Whereas primitive man found himself in extreme dependence upon nature, and whereas such was still the case to a great degree even in the Middle Ages, in modern capitalistic society you have a technology and natural science which enables man to master nature and which contain the possibility of immeasurable extending to this mastery. No modern natural scientist believes in magical formulas. The technologist who wants to produce some machine will not go about it like an Australian magician or a Siberian shaman, but he will attend to the known quantities and behavior of his material and then produce a machine accordingly. It does seem strange that under such conditions religious ideas can still be present in modern capitalistic society. But the source of these ideas in modern capitalist society is not nature, it is society itself. The significant fact here is that the ruling class knows well enough the methods of mastering nature, but knows no methods of planfully mastering society. As you know from our reading in political economy, capitalist social order is throughout characterized by the fact that it does not produce planfully as a whole, but that in it blind anarchy reigns. Capitalistic society does not control its own economic and social life. Rather, every individual and society as a whole is controlled by that life. Thus, capitalist society copes with its own economy, not otherwise, than the Australian savage copes with lightning, thunder, or rain. This characteristic of capitalist society is brought into sharpest relief in times of economic crisis. in times of war and revolution. In an economic crisis, hundreds of thousands of livelihoods are extinguished without the individual being able to defend himself against it, without his being able to escape this fate. Capitalist economy runs its course from depression to extreme prosperity, from prosperity to crisis, without being able to influence this development, without being able to foresee the occurrence of the crisis, without being able to avert it. Ever more extensive become these catastrophes, which sweep over capitalist society in times of war, when millions of men are killed, when millions in goods are destroyed, and capitalist society is unable to do anything about it. No one wants millions of men to be killed, no one wants millions in goods to be destroyed, and yet capitalist society is powerless to protect itself against this. Indeed, it is capitalist competition itself which leads to such crises, and to the solution of these crises through wars and through revolutions. These facts completely explain why religious ideas have not expired even in modern capitalist society, why they have social roots here, and also why they continue to exist and why they will continue to exist as long as this social base exists. It is significant that religious currents in their cruder or more refined forms surge up most strongly in the ruling class in times of such crisis, wars, or revolution. You all know, or perhaps you do not, but it is a fact, that a new religious movement sprang up among the European bourgeoisie during the World War. New religions currents also appeared in conjunction with the revolutions which marked the close of the World War. We have an extraordinarily strong revival and spread of spiritualism, or occultism, that calls for belief in spirits or ghosts. This is a belief which is no different from the belief of Bushmen. And besides these crude forms of religion, there are refined forms which are not recognizable at first glance. Forms which are more or less related to the primitive beliefs of early man, that the souls of the dead exist independently of their bodies, and that they can influence human life. In such times as the present, when the development of the European bourgeoisie is on the downward path, when they perceive opposed to them the proletarian revolution, religion becomes for them to a means of consolation and invigoration, a prop on which they support themselves when the ground begins to slip from under their feet. There have, however, been times when the bourgeoisie fought against religion. These were times when the church formed a part of those classes against which the bourgeoisie had to organize their revolution, when the church was bound together with feudalism and with absolute monarchy. At such periods, although they were only very brief, the bourgeoisie became anti-religious and called upon the people to combat religion and the church. But as soon as the bourgeoisie had conquered power with the help of the people and was seated in authority, it always reversed its stand, for it discovered that religion was also an excellent support for its political and economic authority. We shall speak later of the period when the bourgeoisie prepared its revolution and waged war on the church and religion. By and large, however, such periods were of short duration. As soon as they found it to their interests to keep the great masses in a state of oppression, they transformed religion into a means of authority, a spiritual means of oppression against the great masses of people. I shall now turn to the role which religion plays in another great class in modern society, namely the farmers. In modern society, a farmer, and particularly the small farmer, is distinguished by a very special social and economic position, and he has a special relation to nature. The small farmer is not in possession of modern techniques as is the great capitalist entrepreneur. He works with relatively primitive, simple tools since his enterprise is not great enough for the full employment of modern science and technology. Accordingly, the farmer is found in much greater dependence upon natural events than is the capitalist entrepreneur. The farmer is dependent upon rain and sunshine, on the conditions of the soil, and on incalculable natural events which he cannot master, can only slightly influence, and which confront him as a superior force. Thus we see in the case of the small farmer that religion has its roots in his condition in his relation to nature. but also in his social relations and his class position. The farmer, insofar as he does not carry on a simple nature economy, is a producer of commodities. He raises grains and cattle and offers them as commodities on the market. What becomes of this grain and cattle and how his income is determined depends on the market. For an individual farmer, the market determines whether he has worked for nothing, whether he receives the full value of his labor or only a part. It is not the farmer himself who determines the price, but ultimately his destiny is dependent upon this economic force, upon these market relationships. Let us take a farmer who grows rice in China. When he is about to sell the rice, the price does not simply depend on the amount of the labor which he has put in while producing it. It depends on the market prices, which are determined on the exchange in London or New York. And all too often, the farmer finds himself in a situation where he is destroyed through the laws of the market, which he does not know, or which, even when he does know them, he can neither control nor influence. Another example, there are hundreds of thousands or millions of farmers in India who produce the blue dye material, indigo. After chemistry succeeded in producing artificial indigo, all of this production and therefore untold numbers of farm households were destroyed. Such being the position of the farmer, with his extraordinarily close dependence on natural events on the one hand, and his dependence on the capitalist market, and on the laws of capitalist society. On the other hand, it is clear that here again we are confronted with quite obvious sources of religious ideas. That class of modern society which, because of its position, is most predisposed to break with the religious ideas is the modern working class, the proletariat. The basis for this is clear. The working class, by virtue of its position, is the most revolutionary class in modern society. As such, it sees that religious ideas are the means by which it is consoled by the ruling class for its poverty on earth through promises of joy in heaven. The working class also sees that the bourgeoisie itself is not content with heavenly goods, but strives to snap up as many earthly goods as possible, and therefore sees that its promises are not sincere. In addition, Christianity, as the erstwhile religion of slaves, also preaches the sentiment of resignation. This is a valuable aspect of Christianity for the ruling class, but an attitude which every worker must repudiate. This also explains why the European bourgeoisie is so extraordinarily intent upon exporting the religion of contentment to the colonial countries, to India, China, Africa, etc. It is a situation convenient and agreeable to English imperialism, when the missionary preaches to the Chinese that he should place his hope in heaven, that he should be content and submissive, whereas the capitalist may go to church on Sunday, but on weekdays strive to appropriate China's earthly goods. This explains why, wherever European capitalists penetrate, they send alone with whiskey, the Bible, and the missionary. There are other motives too which impel the modern worker to throw religion overboard, to construct for himself a modern worldview. The modern worker does not have the same relation to nature as the farmer. The worker is in contact with the machine. He understands technology. It does not occur to him to give supernatural meanings to natural occurrences. By virtue of his place in the labor process, the worker has a natural and not a fantastic attitude toward natural events. In accordance with its position in the social hierarchy, the proletariat is the one class which has insight into the nature of capitalist economy. It is the historical task of this class to overthrow the society which is abandoned to the mercy of blind chance and to replace it with a socialist society in which man systematically molds not only nature but economic life as well. As a result of his position, the modern worker can most easily and fully loosen the grip of the fantastic ideas of religions. Thus today, in all modern capitalist countries, we see that it is actually only the working class which makes a complete break with religious ideas. Of course, there are still workers who are religious. It would be false to deny this. But this is in the last analysis due to the fact that the working class is subjected to the stultifying influence of the church and the bourgeois education. and only through its own study and observation can it free itself from this influence. Under capitalist relations, it will always be only a minority of the working class which will be able to achieve this complete intellectual freedom. Not until capitalist authority has been overthrown are the conditions created for the complete uprooting of religion in the working class. Chapter 3: Greek Materialism. In the last chapter, we considered how religion endured in capitalist society, and especially how the economic and social role of the various classes determined their relation to religion. I shall now turn to a brief description of the different points of views which one can take towards religion. There are two fundamentally different positions. One is the position of rationalism. It is characteristic of this position to consider religion simply as something which is irrational and which sufficient knowledge will erase from the mind. The term quote-unquote rationalists is applied here because the French philosophers of the 18th century tool the point of view of quote-unquote reason in their struggle against religion and the church. That is, the point of view that religion is simply something irrational, an error, which can and will be eradicated through knowledge. The characteristic of this position is that it is unhistorical. It does not comprehend religion as something which has emerged from historical forces and which must be destroyed by still other historical forces. I cite this position especially because we still find it very prevalent even today, and particularly among bourgeois revolutionaries or progressives. This position, though appearing to be very radical, is nevertheless not very effective in the struggle against religion. The second position on religion is the position which accepts Marxist science, the position of dialectical materialism. This point of view differs from rationalism in that it looks upon religion as an historical phenomenon, as a phenomenon which has its roots in the material conditions of society, in its mode of production, and which at a certain period in fact played a progressive role in the relation of society to nature and in the building of society itself. This conception opposes religion on the ground that it has now become a hindrance to further social development, though it still has material roots in capitalist society. The practical inference from this position is that it is not sufficient simply to destroy religion through knowledge, but that we must lay hold of the material roots of religion, of the mode of production, in order to overcome it completely. Such an attack produces a twofold change. First, the replacement of the contemporary class structure by a classless socialist society. This destroys the most fertile source of religion, namely the inability of capitalist society to control its own destiny. And second, with this transition to the socialist mode of production, the relation of society and of individuals to nature is also changed. Socialist classless society bases itself, as far as its technology is concerned, upon the achievement bequeathed by capitalism, and develops them to their greatest efficiency. It is apparent that these two bases of religious fantasy cannot be destroyed through knowledge alone, but in the last analysis only through complete social revolution. This position does not preclude the necessity for dissemination of anti-religious information, for the spreading of information is itself part of the preparation for revolution. But it teaches how to estimate properly the effect of propaganda, and how to orient it correctly in the total labor of revolutionary preparation, that is, as a part which is subservient to the whole of the political and economic struggle. Hence, this conception also teaches us how to carry on the work of propaganda against religion, most expediently and effectively. Now I wish to speak of the historical and practical attitude of the Communist Party toward religion. The party, as you know, is a voluntary organization of men who fundamentally hold to the same viewpoint. The fundamental viewpoint of communism is that of dialectical materialism. It therefore follows that in the Communist Party itself, every member is required to have freed or to be freeing themselves of religious ideas and to assume the position of dialectical materialism. Anyone who is still attached to religious ideas and continues to hold to them cannot, therefore, in the nature of the case, be a member of the Communist Party. You further know that everyone who wants to become a member of the Communist Party in Russia has to go through preliminary schooling during which the viewpoint is explained. It also follows from this that the party as such carries on anti-religious propaganda. The party also works through the medium of the school to eradicate religious superstitions from the minds of the younger generation, or to prevent them from arising. As regards the place of religion in the Soviet Union in general, it is quite different from what is in the Communist Party itself. The Communist Party is a voluntary association of the like-minded. The Soviet Union is an association of men of various dispositions. In the Soviet Union, everybody has the right to hold and practice whatever religious ideas he pleases. There is only this difference from most, but not all, of the bourgeois states, that anyone who holds definite religious ideas and wishes to create organizations to serve these ideas must pay for them out of his own pocket. The Soviet state assumes a wholly neutral position in regard to all church-going communities. They must support themselves, maintain their parishes, their priests, etc., and they must fulfill still another condition. This stipulates that religious communities carry on no counter-revolutionary agitation against the Soviet state. As you know, it often happens that priests are summoned before revolutionary tribunals and punished. This never occurs because of their religious ideas, propaganda, etc., but because of their counter-revolutionary activity. On condition that the religious community maintains itself and that it does not carry on propaganda against the Soviet state, under these reasonable conditions, every religious society in Soviet Russia has free rein. The most important means employed in the Soviet Union to eradicate religious superstition is anti-religious propaganda and education in the building of socialism. Only complete material freedom, not merely legal freedom such as already exists in many bourgeois states, can give the full intellectual freedom which renders them competent to free themselves from religious ideas. And furthermore, not until this material freedom is won does the great mass of people have the necessary leisure, the necessary free time to pursue science and art. It may be asked, what takes the place of religion after it is destroyed? To this, the best answer is an aphorism of the poet Goethe, who said, quote, "He who has art and science has religion. He who has neither art nor science ought to have religion." I.e., such a person needs religion. What a man like Goethe claimed only for a small group of highly cultured people, but would deny to the great masses, will apply to all. In bourgeois society, some could become intellectually free. In a fully developed socialist society, all can become free. This matter we must also view as dialectical materialists. From our general survey, we have seen that while today it is a hindrance to social development that only a small number of privileged have the material opportunity to become free, formally, due to the underdevelopment state of the forces of production, it was a necessary prerequisite for the creation of conditions which now make the material and intellectual emancipation of the broad mass of the people possible. The emancipation of a minority from immediate productive work of certain classes, castes, or ranks was a prerequisite for the development of natural science and technology, which, as soon as the necessary social conditions are created, provide the material possibility for the free cultural development of all. In this connection, I want to point out to you what is meant by historical dialectics. You have already met the term several times. From this instance, we see that it means that a phenomenon which is necessary under certain conditions and signifies progress, under changed historical conditions, straightway changes to its opposite and becomes a hindrance to further development. In the role of religion in different historical periods, we see the elucidation of the universal law of historical development, namely development through opposites or contradictions. We shall further see that this law of development through contradictions is valid not only for historical motion, but that it is a law of all motion. The struggles from which the modern worldview has emerged have gone on for over 2,000 years. It did not appear overnight. Along the path of these struggles lies the development of philosophy and the modern natural science. Dialectical materialism is the last and highest step in this development, the end result of the struggles which have raged since the earliest historical time. The point of departure for the modern worldview is ancient Greece. Here is the cradle of philosophy and natural science. Here were laid the foundations of the modern worldview. Therefore, I shall begin with Greece. I shall also touch briefly upon India to deal with the struggle against religion, and finally I shall deal with China. First of all, a few words about the universal material conditions for the development of philosophy and science and for the disintegration of the popular religion in ancient times in ancient Greece, in India, and in China. When I come to speak of Greece, India, and China, I shall become specific and describe the peculiar conditions leading to the destruction of the old religions in each of the countries mentioned. Of the universal conditions, the first in importance is the advance in the development of the productive capacity and the productiveness of the economy and the mastery of nature. The advances from the primitive communistic stage are distinctly connected with the development of private property and a commodity economy. Most crucial for these advances is the development of agriculture. After this, the establishment of the first form of capital, merchant capital or business capital, and money capital, plays an important role. The second and closely related condition is this, that with the development of a commodity economy in which merchant capital and money capital grow up alongside of the priestly class and of the landowners, a new class of people appears to enjoy free time, who have leisure to develop themselves and to dedicate themselves to art and science. One can say quite generally that this development in ancient times is most intimately connected with the development of the slave economy. Slave economy on the land, slave plantations, and slave economy in the cities where the wholesale manufacture of the industrial articles were carried on by slaves. Slave economy also plays an important role in shipping. The great merchant ships which in ancient times sailed the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, etc., were in the main manned by slaves. Thus, the basis of this entire development, which began to undermine ancient religion and which laid the groundwork for the modern worldview, is the emergence and establishment of a slave economy. Through the slave economy, it first became possible for another class of free people to emerge. In addition to the priests, a class which had the necessary time to devote itself to other things than to the direct labor of earning a living. As Aristotle said, leisure is the premise of philosophy. In an earlier period, before slave economy is developed to its full height, we have an intermediate stage, where free peasants and craftsmen emerge. Upon this foundation is built the authority of the so-called tyrants in the Greek cities, that is, the despotism of one individual among the citizens of the city. The term tyrants can easily be translated into Chinese. It means military commander. The consequences of this great economic and class upheaval were severe disturbances, changes, and upheavals in traditional moral and political views. It is clear that when a people who have lived hundreds and thousands of years in the same relationships are subjected to basic economic and social changes, all their thinking, and especially their thinking on religious subjects, will be profoundly affected. In Greece, especially, the development of philosophy and natural science is closely related to the development of Greek commercial cities on the coast of Asia Minor, where as early as the 17th and 16th 7th and 6th centuries BC, there emerged a materialistic viewpoint, opposed to the priesthood in India. The turn against religion was related to the establishment and the strengthening of the military nobility and the merchantry, who turned against the Brahman priests. In China, Lao Tzu and Confucius appeared at a time when the old feudalism was falling, when a free agriculture was emerging, and when upon this foundation a centralized monarchical bureaucratic state was being established. I now turn to Greece. I shall first briefly describe the general conditions for the emergence of Greek natural philosophy. Here we are concerned with a number of philosophers commonly designated Ionians, after the group to which they belonged. The general basis for the emergence of this first philosophy is the development of the Greek commercial cities on the coast of Asia Minor. These cities, of which the most important were Miletus and Ephesus, stand culturally and economically far above contemporary Greek development. They stand much higher than the cities of Greece itself, the Greek peninsula. In these cities, for the first time, it was possible for other people besides priests to obtain great wealth and be in a position to dedicate themselves to free investigation. This development was further influenced by the fact that through the growth of commercial shipping, the intellectual horizon of these Greeks of Asia Minor was tremendously widened. These first Greek merchants traversed the whole Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea, etc., with their merchant ships. They came to know many strange peoples, religions, manners, and customs. Thus it came about that they grew critical of their own religion, of their own customs, and came to look upon all these things with a clearer vision. The development of shipping and commerce demands a correspondingly higher technical development. The commodities with which the ships were laden, the raw materials, were refashioned in the cities. There finally developed from commercial shipping a number of different highly developed industries, one of the most important being the manufacture of wool into fine mantles. Other luxury industries also developed, the manufacture of Greek vases, for example, which were common in all the ancient maritime countries. Further, the manufacture of ornaments out of expensive metals and expensive stones, as well as the manufacture of costly ornamented weapons, played an important role. These commodities were made to sell to the kings, nobles, and high officials of the great Oriental kingdoms. The development of commercial shipping, on the other hand, was connected with the importing of grain and other vital necessities. This resulted in the impoverishment of the old native landed proprietors. The peasants who served these great landed proprietors were able to free themselves and go into the cities as craftsmen. There was established a class of free craftsmen in the Greek commercial cities of Asia Minor, and over these craftsmen the so-called tyrant ruled. Who was this tyrant? He was usually a rich landed proprietor who turned to commerce and finance. He was as a rule one of the richest persons in the city. Because of his wealth and because of the presence of many free men without land who sought occupation, he was able to hire a body of troops and to impose his authority upon the city by force. This is the background and point of departure for Greek natural philosophy. Through the development of technology, handicraft, and shipping, and through the extension of the geographical horizon, the prerequisites were created for seeking a natural explanation of the world, as opposed to the fantastic explanation of the priests. Men who had made long journeys within the bounds of the Mediterranean Sea, who had made themselves familiar with the elements of astronomy, of geography, etc., who found shipping necessary to them, and who had seen many foreign peoples and their customs, these men could undertake to build a scientific worldview. They had the necessary free time, the necessary means, and the impulse to acquire knowledge, and they also had the necessary independence for such an undertaking. Thus we understand how from such relationships philosophy could take its first flights, and how criticism could overthrow the old popular religion. I should like to add a few more words about the tyrants and contemporary conditions. These tyrants, it is very important to note, were supported by the people against the city nobility. With the help of the people, they raised themselves above the city nobility, who were at the same time merchants. Thus they dominated the richest noble merchants. The merchant nobility, after they won over the people and established a body of troops for themselves, they oppressed the people. Thus, throughout all antiquity, the struggle against the tyrants is considered a meritorious thing. Meritorious thing. The principal hold which they had over the people was the work which they provided for craftsmen on public buildings. The most beautiful buildings in the Greek commercial cities of Asia Minor were built by these tyrants. Further, it is very important to mention that all these Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor continually had to defend their national independence against the great Persian Empire. They waged a national struggle for freedom. This struggle for freedom developed the intellectual powers, the self-consciousness of the cities, which became the foundation for free intellectual development. One more comment on the development of slave traffic. Slave traffic played an important role in these cities. In ancient times, and even in Middle Ages, slaves were one of the chief articles of trade. But the slave economy in these cities was only in its infancy. In the 7th and 6th century, most of the craftsmen of these cities were still freemen, that is, independent craftsmen or wage laborers. I now turn to the most important Ionian philosophers of nature and their doctrines. The earliest of these philosophers of nature, most called the father of philosophy, is a certain Thales of Miletus. At this time, Miletus was the richest of all the commercial cities of Asia Minor. She commanded a great merchant fleet, ruled over a great tract of land. Very little of the theory of Thales has come down to us, but it is characteristic of him that he had a natural theory of the origin of the world. This indeed is one of the first questions which religion also seeks to answer. Quote, how did the world begin? Unquote. Thales tried to give a natural explanation of this. The world, he said, came into being from water. This was the beginning and the true essence of all things. It was reasoned that all the other elements at that time, the elements were divided into water, fire, air, and earth, derived from water. This was based on the notion that all substances were unitary, that all substances were capable of changing into each other. Of course, this early philosophy could not establish this assertion in a manner such as is employed by chemistry today. The idea that life first originated from water was also part of the theory. You knows that modern natural science explains that all land animals arose from sea animals and that life first appeared in the sea. Hence, this proposition contains, as we see, an ingenious presentiment of future discoveries. It is natural that Thales should have hit upon the idea that water was the material source of the universe, living as he did in a commercial city that lay by the sea. It was a city in constant contact with this element of continually changing appearance. This element, teeming with an inexhaustible wealth of living creatures useful to men, a city for which the sea was the foundation of economic life. It is also asserted of Thales that he had made great advances in astronomy and geometry. He is said to have made journeys to the Egyptian priests, from whom he obtained a great deal of his knowledge. This indicates that the knowledge of the Egyptian priests became one of the starting points for philosophy. The Egyptian priests had a special motive for developing natural philosophy. Egyptian life depends upon artificial irrigation from the Nile. Without artificial irrigation, the land would be a desert. In order to be able to regulate irrigation, the priests had to be able to predict the time of the Nile's ebb and flow. And to do this, they had to observe the stars. Irrigation, like the building of temples, required surveying the land. These were the motives which led the Egyptian priests to develop the elements of surveying and astronomy, as well as of mathematics. Quote, these elements were taken over, systematized, and further developed by the first Greek philosophers of nature. End quote. Chapter 4. Greek Idealism. Chapter 4. Greek Idealism. From the further development of Greek materialistic philosophy, I shall select only the most prominent names and schools: Anaximander, Heraclitus, and the Atomists, most prominent of whom are Democritus and Empedocles. I begin with Anaximander. Like Thales of Miletus, he comes from the renowned Greek commercial city of which we have already spoken. He lived somewhat after Thales. His theory is characterized by the proposition that the world has emerged from formless stuff, from unformed homogeneous matter, as he called it. The development of this matter, or of this formless stuff, occurs through its separation into contradictory elements. This is the way the heavenly bodies came into being, the sun and the other stars. Man developed from fish-like beings which had taken to the land. To this conception of the world, of the planets, and of life, Anaximander added the conception of the future decline of the world. If the emergence of the world consists in the division of matter, and the breaking up of matter into opposite elements, then the decline of the world, of individual beings, consists in dissolution of these elements. According to Anaximander's theory, matter is eternal and indestructible. As you see, it is a fairly broadly constructed theory of the development of the world, a theory which is completely materialistic, that is, deriving from natural causes. One cannot help being astonished at its correctness enlarged at a time when all the great accomplishments of modern natural science were lacking. The second great name which I mention is that of Heraclitus, the obscure of Ephesus. The nickname obscure was given to him because of the obscurity and the difficulty of his writings. Heraclitus was also born in one of the greatest commercial cities of Greek Asia Minor, Ephesus. This city was one of the strongest competitors of Miletus. He lived about 500 years before Christ. His great significance lies in the fact that he first discovered and gave expression to the qualities of what later developed into dialectics. I shall recount his principal ideas. Heraclitus arrived at his conceptions of the origin and nature of the world by synthesizing previous doctrines concerning the emergence of the world, the previous cosmology. Every previous philosopher had the world emerging from a different stuff. One, like Thales, from water, another from light, a third from the stuff in general. From these doctrines, Heraclitus elaborated the general universal transformation of all things. This conception he compressed into the striking proposition, quote, everything is in flux, end quote. That is, everything is changing, nothing remains as it is. He also compressed it into another proposition, quote, one cannot ascend the same river twice, end quote. This contained the same thought, differently expressed. The river never remains the same. Every instant it is a different river. In this instance, the river, of course, is only a figure of speech. It serves as the symbol of all the changes in nature and in the human world. This conception of the unceasing universal change of all things can be taken as a fundamental conception of dialectics. According to the view of Heraclitus, the world as a whole is eternal, that is, infinite in time and endless, that is, infinite in space. But this world is always changing. It never remains the same. This change, however, is not conceived in terms of modern evolution. According to Heraclitus, world change does not proceed continuously forward, but in what the physicists and chemists call a circular process. It is a constant transformation of things. which, however, always reverts to a certain starting point. For example, like all his predecessors, Heraclitus differentiates four elements: fire, earth, and water. Fire, earth, air, and water. These four elements continuously change into each other, but in such a manner that the change always occurs within the same circle of the four elements. This change of things occurs, according to Heraclitus, not arbitrarily, but in accordance with certain mass relationships. It is regular change. This also as a new and advanced thought. Heraclitus called the world an internal fire, again figuratively of course. He did not mean that the world emerged from fire as the prime stuff. Fire was merely a figurative designation for the continual process of change. The world is not a stable substance, but a continual chemical process. I have already said, and I need not elaborate, that the Heraclitean conception of chance must not be confused with the modern concept of evolution. It is a change that occurs in a circle and which reverts to the original starting point. Another basic idea of Heraclitus is that this change of all things follows the rule that opposites always emerge from opposites. That is, that this change always takes place in the form of contradictions. For this, too, he found a striking metaphorical expression, quote, "Conflict is the father of all things." The conflict of opposites is the impulse to change, to all development. This is also a fundamental conception of dialectics, and Heraclitus was able to express even this thought in very general fashion. He applied it to the relation of being and non-being. Heraclitus said that being and non-being, these two extreme opposites, come together in the concept of becoming. The thought is clear. A thing that is becoming is, and at the same time is not, that thing. These two ideas are contained in becoming. Otherwise expressed, the nature of all things and processes consists of the togetherness of opposites. All things, in other words, are polar, are composed of opposites or contradictions. Also germane to the theory of Heraclitus is the fact that he declared himself against the notion of the immortality of the soul. He also declared himself against the doctrine that sensual pleasure is bad, a doctrine which at that time played an important role among certain religious societies, and we shall soon see why. I proceed now to another point, namely the explanation how this theory of Heraclitus is connected with the mode of production and with the class relationships of the time. From your actual observation of contemporary events, it is understandable to you how a worldview is connected with certain class attitudes. This observation, which we can make today, holds for all periods. Each worldview has its roots in certain class relationships. There is only this difference. We can very clearly see the modern class relations, whereas the class relations of 2000 to 3000 years ago are only in small part known. Often we have to guess at these because the historical sources are meager. Concerning the class position of Heraclitus, we can roughly say the following. He belonged to the municipal aristocracy in Ephesus. I have already discussed the rule of the aristocracy in these cities. Previous to the time of Heraclitus, a government of such aristocrats existed, but this had been unseated by the government of a tyrant or military commander. This tyrant was supported by the mass of petty craftsmen and peasant against the aristocracy. Later, the rule of the tyrant yielded to a more or less restricted democracy, which was brought into Ephesus by the citizens of the city of Athens. Heraclitus, who belonged to the aristocracy against which the tyrant fought and against which the tyrant played the masses of the people, was naturally considered a revolutionary. The existing state of affairs was not to his liking. He was anxious to overthrow it. Therefore, there developed in him the conception that it is a general law of all existing things not to remain as they are, but to change. To change indeed into their opposites. From the relations which prevailed in the city he arrived at the idea that conflict is the impulse of all change. and he came to the conclusion that this holds not only for political and social relations in the city, but that it applies universally. I believe that the concept of dialectics will now be accessible to you. The masses of the people in Ephesus were severely oppressed and exploited by the tyrants. They had to work for the tyrants. They had to pay heavy tribute, and in part also to perform forced labor. In this situation, the masses of the people sought any ideas at all which could give them consolation, and so they took refuge in religion, which gave them the consolation they needed. They established religious groups which sought security in the theory of a Redeemer, who would come and free the people, in the theory of the immortality of the soul, and in the evil of sensual pleasures, a theory which is very congenial to an exploited mass of people. When men turn against sensual pleasures, this signifies a political break with a repudiation of the luxurious life of the rich. All should live as simply and frugally as possible, and avoid luxury. This idea is congenial to the exploited and oppressed masses at a time when the material prerequisites are not yet at hand for all to be able to live in plenty, that is to say, when the productiveness of labor is still poorly developed. And this was the case then, as opposed to the situation now in capitalist society. Heraclitus' attitude is explained in the simplest manner by reference to the role of the mass of the people, the role of the tyrant, and Heraclitus' own membership in the aristocracy. Since the tyrant was supported by the mass of people against the aristocracy, Heraclitus had to turn against the ideas of these masses, against their religious ideas, against the conception of a Redeemer, against the immortality of the soul, and against the doctrine of the evil or sensual pleasures. Thus you see that all the fundamental ideas in Heraclitus are determined or conditioned by the characteristic class relations of his time. I should now like to make a few brief comments on the theory of atoms. Atomic theory, or atomicists, was developed by a number of these philosophers of nature. The principal proposition of the theory maintains that the world consists of small, identical material parts in empty space. The various movements of these material parts explain all phenomena. I do not need to develop this theory further. Atomic theory is today a part of natural science, of chemistry, of physics, etc. The significance of atomic theory in antiquity, however, lay in the fact that it was the most consistent development of materialism. This theory of atoms has played a part in all consistent theories of materialism for thousands of years. With this, I close the discussion of the Ionian natural philosophy, the period of materialistic philosophy in ancient times, and come now to a most important turning point. When materialist philosophy was replaced by idealist philosophy. This turning point is linked with the names of two great philosophers of ancient times, Plato and Aristotle. Plato was born in 429 BC, Aristotle in 384 BC. They are thus somewhat later than the Ionian philosophers of nature. These two philosophers of idealism have had a tremendous influence on the whole subsequent period, on the philosophy of the Middle Ages, as well as on the worldview of modern times. In the last analysis, we can say that all idealistic worldviews have their own origin in Plato and Aristotle. We will now investigate the reasons for this transition from the materialist to the idealist worldview. The fundamental reason for this is the complete development of slave economy as the basis of Greek society and the beginning of its decline. This society, founded on slave labor, led into a blind alley with no way out. In the 7th century, slave labor was just appearing in the Greek colonies of Asia Minor, although slave trade was already in full swing. Industrial labor was, in the main, performed by handicraftsmen, of free-wage laborers. In the 5th and 4th centuries, however, in Athens, where the philosophers Plato and Aristotle lived and taught, slave labor was the foundation of the state and of the whole economy. Slavery was the basis of the class systems in Athens at that time, and not, as has often superficially been contended, the opposition between aristocracy and democracy, which was only an opposition within the ruling class, which consisted of free citizens. Both the rich and poor citizens were propped on the shoulders of slaves. The rich, as well as the poor freemen in Athens, lived at the expense of the slaves, who were without rights, who were not considered men but simply tools endowed with speech. That the Athenian people were able to devote themselves to politics, art, philosophy, gymnastics, and all such fine things was made possible only by the abundant and constant importation of slave laborers. This is not simply my opinion. It is taken from a work on ancient Athens by a good bourgeois historian. I shall now develop the contradictions which beset a society which is built on a slave economy. First contradiction and first difficulty. In no slave economy is the natural propagation of slaves sufficient to maintain it. This experience is not restricted to antiquity. The same thing occurred in the slave plantations in the south of the United States of America. To maintain the slave economy, there must be a continual importation of new slaves. They can be attained only through wars or predation. Continual waging of war, which is necessary for a state built on a slave economy, naturally saps the strength of such a state. To wage war in ancient times, it was necessary for the citizen about to go to war to furnish his own equipment. This was costly, of course, especially for a mounted warrior. He had to maintain his horse and a groom. He had to be able to support his dependents at home as well as himself in the field. This necessity gradually impoverished the simple farmers and artisans who participated. Thereby the power of the state was diminished, and it was exposed to the danger of being conquered by another state, where the farmers and artisans were not yet undermined. To be humbled and conquered meant something quite different than from what it means today. It meant that the people would be carried off as slaves, men, women, and children. The second contradiction in which society built on slave labor is involved is the following. It is proudly maintained in such society that working for a living is unworthy of a free man. Labor is stigmatized as unworthy. Labor is only for slaves. This conception of labor dominated the best and most open minds of antiquity, and it had a further consequence. The free people who could not exploit slaves were dependent on the state for a livelihood. They were parasites, spongers on the state. The unpropertied freeman of antiquity was fundamentally different from the modern proletariat. The latter, through his labor, supports the whole society, the capitalists, and everything else. The unpropertied freeman, the proletarian of antiquity, was supported by the state at the expense of slave labor. The state itself maintained a great number of slaves who provided the means of support for the unpropertied freeman. Moreover, a powerful city like Athens subjugated a great number of other cities who had to pay tribute, which also served to maintain these unpropertied freemen. Thus the existence of such a city was naturally very precarious. A society which rests on such an uncertain foundation as slave labor becomes increasingly involved in difficulties. The third contradiction within the city, which was at the same time a state, city and state are here one, is the following. Within this city there developed, even among the freemen, more and more class oppositions. The great private fortunes increased and fell into the hands of fewer people, whereas the artisans were impoverished by continual warfare. This sharpened the opposition between creditors and debtors. At the same time, the moral bond which bound the city dwellers to each other became weaker and weaker, and this led to continual civil wars which jeopardized the existence of the state more and more. Further, I should like to mention a fourth and very important point in the realm of economics. Slave labor hinders technical progress. The connection here is very clear. Since slaves work only under compulsion, they cannot be given very delicate or complicated tools. Slave labor can only be accomplished with the crudest and roughest tools. As soon as slave labor becomes the characteristic phenomenon of a society, technical development is hindered, and the development of the forces of production is brought to a standstill. Thus, at the highest height of the slave economy in antiquity, we find technical stagnation, and also a loss of the interest in natural science, such as was prevalent in the colonies of Asia Minor, which we have mentioned. These, these conditions resulted in the following. First, that the problem of development in nature and the problem of the origin of the world no longer stood in the foreground as they did in the ascending period of Greek social development. Instead, the questions characteristic of society in its Middle Ages stages are emphasized. How should man live? How should the state be governed? How should the economy be carried on? What is good? What is evil? What is permitted? What is forbidden? All these questions of morals now become matters of controversy. The second and most important result linked with the transition to the declining phase of ancient society is the transition from the materialistic to the idealistic worldview. This critical change from materialism to idealism is conditioned by and based on the facts which I have already set forth. It was conditioned namely by the circumstance that the old slave-owning society had passed its apex and had entered upon its declining phase. I should like to sketch very briefly the main features of Plato's idealism, so that you may know something about the idealism here indicated. According to Plato, the true essence of things does not consist of a stuff, as the philosophers of nature had said, but rather the principle of the world is spiritual, non-material. The world of the senses, the world of sense experience is nothing, Plato's conception, and an actual and true world, but only apparent and illusory. This world of sensory phenomena is only a consequence, a copy of eternal ideas, of internal spiritual prototypes, which are independent of material phenomena. Thus, the true locus of things is posited in the mind. The highest idea is the idea of the good. These ideas not only are the true essence, the very kernel of the world, they are moreover the ultimate impulse and ultimate measure of all events. With Aristotle, this is further developed. Reason is the essence, the ultimate impulse or prime mover of all worldly events. But upon precisely what is this transition from materialism to idealism based? In the last analysis, upon the fact that there is, from the standpoint of the ruling class of this period, no material, historical, progressive solution of social contradictions, as I have already shown. It is not possible for a slave economy to make the transition to a higher form of society and economy. It is a blind alley, a cul-de-sac. I have explained to you how the Christian religion grew up among the oppressed classes. In the same way, idealistic philosophy grew on in the ruling class at this critical moment in the Athenian state. This idealistic philosophy became an element and a basis of later Christianity. What social aim did this idealist doctrine have? Its aim was to idealize the existing social situation, that is, to beautify, to eliminate the contradictions in it, to immortalize it. The supremacy of the idea, the supremacy of reason, was only a universalization of the theory that the reasonable and the wise should rule. And of course, every ruling class conceives these to heed the members of the ruling class itself. The people, according to this notion, are unreasonable, and it is always a very small minority, the ruling class, which is reasonable. When this theory is carried from the state over to the whole world, idealistic philosophy appears, the concept of the supremacy of reason over all things. In the later centuries and millennia, this idealistic philosophy generally became one of the strongest foundations for the views of the ruling class. But you must not think that the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle was in their time reactionary within the ruling class. It was not. Ancient society had no way out. There was no class in the society which could offer any sort of antithetical revolutionary outlet. On the question of slavery, democracy in ancient Greece did not and could not have a fundamentally different viewpoint, since its existence was based on resources of the state provided by slave labor. It would be a very great error to mistake the democracy of Greek antiquity for bourgeois or proletarian democracy. The opposition between ancient Greek democracy and modern bourgeois democracy is even greater than that between bourgeois and proletarian democracy. The basic problems of this ancient society were not those of democracy or aristocracy. These were only problems of the superstructure. The basic problem was slave labor, the relation of the slaves to freemen. The reactionary aspect of this philosophy stands out in bold relief only in relation to slavery, in the fact that it is the philosophy of a slave-owning society, based upon slave labor. It appears reactionary in the light of later historical development, which abolished slave labor and substituted more progressive forms of exploitation. But this philosophy not only had a reactionary aspect, it also had a progressive aspect. We shall speak of this in the next chapter.
Chapter 5 Ancient Logic and Dialectics. Before I go further, I should like to give a few more biographical facts concerning Plato and Aristotle. Plato was born in Athens in 429 BC and came from a distinguished aristocratic family. His main works are put in the form of dialogues or conversations. He was a student of Socrates. Aristotle, in his turn, was a student of Plato. He was born in 384 BC. He was not a native Athenian, but he lived the greater part of his life in Athens and there set up his own school of philosophy. Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedonia. He left many voluminous writings. Not only was he the greatest philosopher of Greek antiquity, but he was also a great natural scientist and the founder of a whole range of sciences. Aristotle was a scientific genius of the first rank, the greatest mind in all antiquity. His influence on the subsequent period was so great that we can say that 2,000 years until the beginning of modern times were under his sway. We previously stressed the reactionary role of the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. Now we shall speak of its great progressive role. This resides in the fact that the ruling classes of Athens at that time believed the aim of the exploitation of slave labor and their class rule to be the free development of human capacities, above all, the development of reason. This is closely connected with the fact that this slave production was not ultimately and predominantly commodity production, not production for the sake of surplus value like capitalist production. Its chief aim was production for individual use, production of use values. From this, it followed that the ruling class was not absorbed in business or industry, but conceived its deal to be the development of art and of science. Thus arose the extraordinary great interest in the investigation of human reason, in the discovery of the laws of thought. Through this activity, the Greeks created a new epoch in the general development of history. As represented by Aristotle, they built up the doctrine of the forms and laws of thought known as formal logic. They also laid the foundation for what is called dialectics. Wherein dialectics and formal logic differ, we shall soon see. The science of the laws of thought, formal logic, reached its highest point with Aristotle. It was here developed so broadly and fully that it was not until the beginning of the 19th century that the German philosopher Hegel could make a significant and decisive advance over it. I will now briefly explain what formal logic is and how it differs from dialectics. Formal logic can be defined as the theory of the laws of thought without regard to the content of thought. The theory of thinking or logic describes how concepts are built and wherein the different concepts differ from each other in regard to form. It deals with the different kinds of propositions and ultimately with the different kinds and forms of inferences, of syllogisms. Logic seeks to teach how to think correctly. Ordinarily, man thinks about nature without having need for any special art of thinking. This generally suffices for everyday life. But as soon as relations and things become more difficult, as soon as man concerns himself with conclusions drawn from a great number of premises, as soon as he becomes involved in a long abstract processes of thought, then the possibility of error grows, and it becomes necessary to control and to ascertain the correctness of thought. Therefore, logic has a far-reaching significance for science. The laws of logic are based on two main propositions. The first is that of identity or of self-conformity. The proposition very simply states, quote, A is A, end quote. That is, every concept is equal to itself. A man is a man. A hen is a hen. A potato is a potato. This proposition forms one basis of logic. The second main proposition is the law of contradiction, or as it is also called, the law of the excluded middle. This proposition states, quote, A is either A or not A, quote. It cannot be both at the same time. For example, whatever is black is black. It cannot at the same time be black and white. A thing, to be put in the general terms, cannot at the same time be itself and its opposite. In practice, it therefore follows that if I draw certain conclusions from a given starting point and contradictions arise, then there are errors in thinking or my starting point was wrong. If for some correct premises I come to the conclusion that 4 is the same as 5, then I deduce from the law of contradiction that my conclusion is false. So far, all appears to be clear and certain. What can be a clearer law than that man is man? A rooster is a rooster, that thing is always the same thing. It even appears to be absolutely certain that a thing is either large or small, either black or white. What it cannot be both at the same time, that contradictions cannot exist in one and the same thing. Let us now consider the matter from the standpoint of a higher doctrine of thought, from the standpoint of dialectics. Let us take the first law, which we have developed as the foundation of logic. A is A. A thing is always the same thing. Without testing this law, let us consider another one which we have already mentioned. The law of Heraclitus, which says, everything is in flux, or one cannot ascend the same river twice. Can we say that the river is always the same? No, the law of Heraclitus says the opposite. The river is at no moment the same. It is always changing. Thus, one cannot twice, nor more exactly even once, ascend the same river. In short, the law, A is A, in the last analysis, is valid only if I assume that the thing does not change. As soon as I consider the thing in its change, then A is always A and something else. A is at the same time not A. And this, in the last analysis, holds for all things and events. Moreover, the seemingly changeless is established by science as changeable. One takes it as a symbol of changelessness, for example, rocks or great mountains. But these rocks, as the history of geography shows, come into being and pass away. The changes, however, take so long in relation to the span of man's life that man does not notice them without special study. They are eroded by wind and by moisture. Under the influence of heat and cold, they are in motion. These are changes which occur so slowly that their process cannot be seen with the eye. They become visible only after long intervals. Or let us take plants. Plants change, grow. This cannot be seen with the naked eye either. It is today possible to see how a plant grows by means of moving pictures. We knew today that various kinds of plants have charged. We know, for example, that wheat, rye, and rice were not always what they are today, and that these plants have developed from simpler ones. This also applies to all types of animals and to human beings. Perhaps the planetary system and the sun are permanent and changeless, but astronomy teaches us that this planetary system must have emerged and that it must again ultimately disappear. Thus, even here there is change, unceasing, boundless change. Man had long believed, until very recent times, that the primordial matter to which all things could be reduced, the chemical elements, were changeless, that this primordial matter was the one thing that did not change. Today it is known that this also is not the case. Elements are known, radium, etc., which change. We suspect that all matter has emerged from still simpler parts, from electrons, that under certain conditions of temperature and pressure they become integrated and that they will eventually disintegrate and be transformed. When we know this, now does the famous fundamental law of logic stand up? that law that a thing is always the same? Evidently, this law is at least not unconditionally correct. It has only a limited significance. It is only valid for certain limited periods of time, or in abstraction. That is, when I ignore the changes of a thing and consider it for the moment as invariable. When I thus control a thing, making it invariable and changeless for a certain length of time, I can operate without falling into great error. But if I generalize and propound without qualifications, I fall into grave errors. Then this law of formal logic does not hold good. I must turn to a higher system, to dialectics. That is, I say that difference is bound up with all identity. Thus in no object can I absolutely separate identity and difference. The object remains the same, and at the same time it changes. Both attributes exist at the same time. A modern bourgeois philosopher, the Frenchman Bergson, fell into the error of overlooking the identity in universal change, and came to the conclusion that the true nature of all things is unknowable, since the understanding can only work with fixed, changeless concepts. Here the error committed is the reverse of the assumption that the law of self-conformity of things is exclusively and unconditionally valid. If I extend the change between two states of a thing so far that no identity at all remains between them, then I cannot establish any change. I am utterly unable to say that they represent two states of one thing. To establish change, I need a single common reference. The quantitative difference between two things or two states of one thing is only possible to determine when I consider them in some way alike. If there is no identity without difference, it is also true that there is no difference without identity. Let us now examine the second basic law of thought, the law of contradiction. According to this law, a thing cannot at the same time be itself and its opposite. A figure is either round or angular. A line is either straight or curved. If we consider what we previously discovered regarding the law of identity, we see that not only is contradiction not impossible, but that everything that changes must at every moment represent a contradiction. We have already said that a thing which changes is identical with itself and is different from itself. It is identical and different, identical and not identical. Within the same thing there exists a contradiction. This law holds generally for all things which change, all things which are identical and not identical, the same and not the same. Let us apply this, for example, to the proposition, quote, a line is either straight or curved, end quote. What do the mathematicians say? They consider the smallest part of a circle as straight. Within a certain limits, they make straight and curved identical. This allows much more precise and certain calculations than if one absolutely separates straight and curved. A figure is either round or angular, but mathematicians consider a circle as a figure with an infinite number of angles. In this relation, they thus make round and angular identical, and an entire section of mathematics is built upon this basic law, which is full of contradictions. In place of the law of contradiction, which simple traditional logic sets up, we can set up the opposite law, the law that everything contains a contradiction within itself, is composed of opposites. We have already verified this in the concept of change which obtains for all things. We have still to verify in a connection with certain propositions of the ancient Greeks. The concept of locomotion, for example, the Eleatic philosophers showed that all locomotion represents a contradiction and is therefore impossible. They concluded, therefore, that there is no actual motion, that motion is an illusion. And they proved this with two famous examples. The first is the proposition of the error. The other is the proposition of Achilles and the tortoise. The proposition of the arrow runs thus. It is asserted that if I shoot an arrow from a point, it can never reach a distant point. For if I shoot an arrow from a point which I designate, A, and this arrow should reach point B, then it is certain that it must have previously traversed the intervening space. From A it must have reached C. Further, it is certain that still before that it must have covered half the distance, AC, that infinitum. It consequently can never depart from A, since the number of distances is infinitely large. In a finite time, it cannot go from A to B. Consequently, motion is impossible. Perhaps even clearer is the example of Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles was reputed to be the most swift-footed of the Greeks. The tortoise is a slow-moving animal. Yet, if the tortoise has any head start at all, Achilles can never catch up with the tortoise. Let us say that the tortoise has a head start of 800 yards. In 1 second, Achilles runs 10 yards, the tortoise 1 yard. What will be the outcome? While Achilles covers a distance of 100 yards, which separates him from the tortoise goes 10 yards farther. While Achilles runs these 10 yards, which still separates him from the tortoise goes 1 yard further. While Achilles runs the 1 yard, the tortoise goes a tenth of a yard, and so on ad infinitum. There always remains a certain distance between them. While Achilles runs through this distance, the tortoise each time covers a distance 1/10 as great. It therefore follows that Achilles will never catch up with the tortoise. These two stories are, of course, not merely jokes. This is a deeper meaning within them. In both cases, it is demonstrated that a certain finite distance can be infinitely divided, and for this very reason, it follows that a finite distance cannot be put together out of many parts. It follows, in other words, that a finite distance cannot consist of infinite parts. Now in notion, it is demonstrated that from infinitely small distances I can put together a finitely large distance. That is, what is here set forth in the form of a story is the dialectical law which we have previously mentioned. It is shown that a distance can be finite as well as infinite, that it can be both, in fact, at the same time. Thus it is true, as can easily be calculated, that the arrow can travel from A to B, and it is just as true that Achilles will overtake the tortoise. Let us take the tortoise. While Achilles has traversed the handicap of 100 yards, the tortoise has gone ahead 10 yards, etc. Thus we have 100 plus 10 plus 1 plus 1 divided by 10 plus 1 divided by 100 equals 111.11 or 111.1/9 yards. At this point, he will overtake the tortoise. He consumes 10 seconds for 100 yards, 1 second for the next 10 yards, 1/10 of a second for the 1 yard, etc. Together, 10 plus 1 plus 1/10 equals 11.1 or 11.19 seconds. Thus the question is solved, and at the same time, we have another verification of our proposition that the motion is contradictory. Now, in order to clarify the matter, I will return to the first example, in which distance, which we designate 1, is composed of 1 to 1/2. Half of the distance is again divided into equal parts of 1/4, which in turn are divided into equal parts of 1/8, etc. Thus we have the series 1/2 to plus 1/4 to plus 1/8 plus 1/16 plus 1/13. If we add them, we find that their sum more and more closely approaches 1. The sum of the infinitely many fractions, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, etc., is the finite total 1. That is perfectly accurate. From my statement that contradictions occur in things, we must not conclude inversely that I always utter a truth when I contradict myself. The matter is not so simple. Rather, these contradictions which appear in concepts are only appropriate and correct if they reflect actual changes in things. Thus, there are meaningful and meaningless contradictions. A dialectics is not the art of meaningless, but of meaningful contradictions. Wherein lies the difference between formal logic and dialectics? If you look closely, you will find that it lies in the following. Formal logic considers all things as motionless and changeless, each as separate from all others, isolated in itself. Dialectics is a higher form of thought, since it considers them also in their motion and in their interconnection. What is the reciprocal relation of formal logic and dialectics? The use of formal logic is limited, restricted. It is a restricted, inferior approach to phenomena. It is admissible so far as I can consider things as unchanged and rigidly demarcated from each other. Dialectics is a superior, more universal, more exact, and more profound approach to phenomena. As soon as I consider things as moved and as changeable, or in their reciprocal connection, I get nowhere with formal logic, and I must turn to dialectics. I wish to add that the dialectics of both Plato and Aristotle had an idealistic character. That is, both assumed that contradictions have their origin in the mind, and that the contradictions in actual things derive from the mind. We materialistic dialecticians say that the contradictions in concepts are only a reflection of the motion of things. To put this even more simply, idealistic dialecticians believe that motion of bodies occurs because a contradiction is present in the concept of motion. The materialistic dialecticians say the opposite. The actual motion of things is the prototype, and the contradictions which appear in the concept are reflections of this actual motion. Let us inquire into the sources of dialectics in antiquity. Why was it that in antiquity man had already come up upon the foundations of the dialectical method of thinking? 1. The old philosophers of nature, Heraclitus, Anaximander, etc., investigated the emergence and decline of the world. They thus had to arrive at the concept of the universal change and the universal motion of all things. I refer to Heraclitus especially. 2. Social relations, meditation on the form of state and on relation, etc., stimulated the consideration of all things as changeful and self-contradictory. This applies especially to Socrates, Plato, etc. The immediate stimulus was that in public life, contradictory viewpoints clashed one with another. Public life in Athens was a very lively affair. In the marketplace, discussions were constantly taking place concerning what is good and what is evil, how the state should be constituted, etc. One said A, another not A. This was true of all things in public and private life. From this, there ultimately developed an art of conversation, and this art of conversation became the source of the art of dialectics. Dialectics was originally called the art of discourse, because it grew out of discourse. This ancient dialectics, as developed by Plato and Aristotle, was not yet the modern dialectics, which is characteristic of dialectical materialism. It was still an underdeveloped dialectics. This is consistent with the social relations from which this manner of thinking emerged. The aim of these ancient thinkers, Plato and Aristotle, was to find amidst the change of social and political matters something permanent, constant, secure, to create an ideal state, an ideal society. They did not seek absolute change. Their aim, on the contrary, was a changeless, constant state of affairs. They did not favor revolution, but rather the suppression of the revolution which had taken place in the social order. This is why Plato constructed a political utopia, an ideal state, and thus is explained limited in a developed form of dialectics in antiquity. In ancient times, there were two stages in the development of dialectics. The first was simply the dialectics of change of the one after the other. This was the dialectics developed by Heraclitus. The second is dialectics as developed particularly by Plato and Aristotle. This is a dialectics not of one after the other, but a dialectic of one beside the other, of the simultaneous, the dialectics which is present in the relation of the parts of a motionless whole to each other. This second form of dialectics is the highest developed in antiquity, but it is a limited form. The higher form of dialectics is that which takes into consideration the dialectics of the simultaneous as well as the dialectics of one after the other. This dialectics is called historical dialectics. This historical dialectics embraces the law of the changes of a whole as well as the law of the simultaneous existence of a whole which is composed of many parts. You have an example of this is from your study of political economy. You remember the way Marx describes capital. You there learned a number of economic laws which show how capitalism can exist as a whole, and how individual phenomena within it are related to each other. Finally, you learned how this whole system emerges from another system, that of simple commodity production, and further, how the laws of the capitalist mode of production are changed in the course of time into other laws, which lead from capitalism into another, opposed system, that of socialist economy. The most highly developed form of the dialectics is Marxian or historical dialectics, which developed from the limited and restricted form of antiquity into a higher form. This ancient dialectics is, in the last analysis, limited and restricted because it is the dialectics of a ruling class which rests on slave labor. Neither Plato nor Aristotle, the most advanced thinkers of the society, could imagine a change in social relations such that slave labor would disappear and that the distinction between free man and slave be abolished. Therefore, it follows that their concept of the change of things had a completely determined social mode, namely the mode wherein domination over slaves must always be changeless, and eternal. Accordingly, they could not develop dialectics in its full universality, since this universality presupposes that no modes can be imposed upon change. But as usurpactionaries of slave ownership, they were unable to presuppose the abolition of slavery. This is the ultimate reason why they could not develop dialectics in its full universality, why it was restricted and idealistic and not materialistic. Chapter 6: Indian Materialism. The Greeks played the leading role in the foundation of science and philosophy, and in the detachment of these from religion. But they are not alone in having made this progress. It is no more than just to mention the great intellectual labor performed by the people of the East, even though this labor was not as consequential as that of the ancient Greeks. The elements of materialism which were developed in the East can there serve as a point of departure for dialectical materialism. Therefore, before concluding the first section of lectures, I should like to speak of materialism in ancient India. I will reserve discussion of China for the last section. In the next chapters, I proceed directly to the doctrines of Marx and Engels. Materialism had already appeared in ancient India by the 6th century BC. This is the period which immediately follows primitive times. This period of primitivity is also called the period of the Vedas, because the Vedas, the oldest religious poems of ancient India, offered the best reflection of this period. The time in which materialism made its appearance is called the epic period of India, because then the great popular epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, emerged. It was a time of great religious and philosophical agitation. Buddhism then made its appearance as the New World religion, and with it an allied religious reform called Jainism. It was thus a time of profound crisis for ancient religious views, a crisis for the ancient religion which bore the name of Brahmanism. The members of the ancient priestly caste of India were called Brahmins. It was a time of broad mass movements against the authority of this Brahmin caste and against the religious views on which the authority of the Brahmins rested. Whence came this crisis? There were profound transformations in the class relations which, in the last analysis, brought on this crisis. Originally, the Brahmins were priests of magic and sacrifice, such as we find more or less among all underdeveloped peoples. Brahma originally signified the magic inherent in them. The Brahmins, the priests, thus developed into the highest ruling caste. They claimed authority over the other three principal castes. They obtained this authority chiefly through their talent for knowing the rituals of sacrifice, which they had built up into a highly developed system. This priestly caste lived at the expense of the other classes on sacrificial offerings which they exacted from them. The Brahmins ruled without serious competition in this early period, in the time of the Vedas. This was a time when the communistic village community prevailed in its primitive form. This village community was founded on agriculture and stock farming, without great economic differences between the individual members of the community, without great differentiation. Hence, a village community had an economically and social democratic government. But then the old inhabitants were subjected by lighter-skinned Aryan Indians who immigrated into India from the north, a fair-complexioned people, linguistically very closely related to European groups, Greeks, Celts, Persians, etc. The conquered natives were made the slaves of the conquerors. Thus was created, instead of free and equal members of the democratic, communistic village community, a class of people who lived not on a basis of social and legal equality, but who were the oppressed, the slaves, the enthralled. The opposition between the ruling conquerors and the defeated natives carried class opposition even into the ranks of the conquerors themselves. So there appeared more and more class oppositions in this primitive communistic village community. The primitive Aryan peasants who were part of the conquerors were often replaced by native slaves. Large estates were built on the foundation of the slave enterprise. The great landed proprietors were, first of all, warlords and great merchants. Merchants often ran their business with slaves also, just as we saw in ancient Greece. In time, the agricultural slaves raised themselves to a higher rank, to thralls such as we have in the Middle Ages. These thralls, or slaves, formed the lowest caste in ancient India. They were called the Sudras. In the northeast, where Buddhism and the religious reform movement emerged, class oppositions developed more sharply than in the east, where the old Brahmanist religion had long held sway. I will now briefly describe the situation in the 6th century, just when materialism and Buddhism emerged in ancient India. At this time, the communistic village community still prevailed, but it had already begun to disintegrate. The land could already be bought or leased, which was not the case in a pure primitive communistic state, since the land belonged to the community. From time to time, it used to be apportioned to individuals, but it could neither be bought nor leased. Since then, many merchants had become land buyers. There were even some free-wage laborers, but only in very insignificant numbers. For the most part, they worked on the greater landed estates, either for board and lodging or for wages. The real slaves were mainly domestic slaves, just as they have been in China for a long time. Crafts developed. Craftsmen were organized in corporations or guilds. Rich merchants were already existed in this period. They did a large business by means of caravans overland or by maritime trade to China, to Alexandria, to Egypt, etc. This trade comprised mainly silks, fine clothes, ivory, jewels, by and large luxuries for the use of kings and nobles. For the most part, barter had already been replaced by money transactions. At this time, there were already money lenders, and in the village, the usurer already played an important role. Accordingly, one can say that a disintegration of primitive, simple communistic village community was already taking place. This disintegration was connected with the introduction of commodity production, and the latter, in turn, with the development of the forces of production in agricultural economy, and with the development of private property. The introduction of slave labor, of the labor of thralls, was linked with the establishment of great landed estates, with the formation of commercial and money capital, agricultural economy, and with the development of private property. The introduction of slave labor, of the labor of thralls, was linked with the establishment of great landed estates. And I'm pretty sure I read that sentence. That's nice. Thus, when we consider the class divisions of the society in which materialism emerged in ancient India, we have the following main characteristic. On one side, the ruling priest caste stood opposed to the noble landed proprietors and the rich merchants. The latter struggled with the priest caste for social supremacy. On the other side, there developed a caste of freemen, who owned little or no property, and a caste of slaves or thralls. These profound social changes from primitive times gave the impulse for a spiritual and religious crisis. On one side, Buddhism emerged as a new, reformed, popular religion opposed to the ancient Brahmins, who were set against the broad masses of the people. On the other side, materialism emerged, the materialistic philosophy which was already breaking through the limitations of religion. Its bearers were characteristically the richest merchants, just as they were in the Greek commercial colonies of Asia Minor. Class differentiation assumed a peculiar form in India, however, namely the form of a caste system. A caste comes into being when the division of labor in a certain society becomes hereditary. That is, the son of a warrior must become a warrior, the son of a potter, etc. Associated with this homogeneity of castes is the fact that the members may marry only in their own caste, that each such caste has special religious customs, special customs in daily life, in eating, in dressing, etc. The precepts and customs of a given caste completely govern all details in the life of a man who belongs to the caste. The formation of castes is not limited to India. In antiquity, we also have a very strong caste system in ancient Egypt. The starting point for the formation of castes in ancient India is already described in the term. The old Indian word for the caste, varna, originally man's color. The starting point was the separation of the light complexioned Aryan conquerors from the dark complexioned natives, who were made slaves or bondsmen. From this separation of dark-colored natives from light-colored conquerors, there came the partition into castes. 4 main castes are distinguished. I list them in the order of rank. The first, the most aristocratic and the ruling caste, was the Brahmin or priest caste. The second, the warrior caste. The third was the caste of the rest of the free men, merchants, and farmers. And the fourth and lowest was the caste of slaves, thralls, or sudras, whom we have already named. Without these class oppositions in the form of castes, the development of thought in ancient India after the Vedic times is not understandable. Therefore, at the outset, one must explain the castes, their significance and role, in order to understand the problems about which thought in ancient India revolved. The fundamental questions of Indian thought revolve around problems related to the nature of the castes, that is, the nature of the special form which class relations assume in India. The fundamental conceptions of Indian thought are derived from this and understandable only through this. The fate of individual men in a caste society was completely determined by the caste into which they were born. Thinking on social questions had to assume the following form. What determines the caste into which an individual is born? The individual wanted to be able to determine this. For him, this offered the only possibility of determining or changing his fate. But this possibility rests upon 2 assumptions. First, that connection exists between the individual's present existence in a certain class, his previous existence in another class, and his future existence in still another form. These connections quite naturally give rise to the idea of regeneration, of the eternal recurrence of birth. The Indian name for this is samsara, recurrence. This name and this conception are familiar to everyone who has the same knowledge of Buddhism. The same conception of eternal regeneration grew up in ancient Egypt and was based on the same relationships. I have already mentioned that ancient Egypt likewise had a caste system. We have here 2 main concepts. The first concept, samsara, or regeneration, is the basis of the second concept, karma, which means that my birth is determined by the fact that I have lived a previous life. If I conduct myself well in this life, I shall perhaps later be born again into a higher caste, or if I behave badly, into a lower caste, or even as an animal or plant. If my behavior is completely good, I may be reborn as a god, or a hero, etc. This is the basic concept of Indian thought, and only in this form, fantasy, is it possible to change caste to change my social destiny. Indian thought resolved revolved about these two fundamental concepts as soon as class oppositions developed and began to be more and more embodied in castes. Buddhism emerged as a rebellion against the caste system in general, and against the supremacy of the priest caste in particular, but as a rebellion still in religious form. I can only touch upon Buddhism here. According to evidence, Buddha himself, the founder of this religion, was a simple nobleman. He belonged to the second caste. He was not the son of a great king, as has often been said. He allied himself with the two castes which were struggling against the Brahmins for social supremacy. Buddhism opposes priestly sacrifice as a means of deliverance. In the acknowledgement of the exclusive power of the Brahmin priests to make offerings lay the foundation of their social dominance, and their economic position was ideologically based on the same thing, since the priests lived on the offerings which were brought to them. Thus Buddhism taught, and this constitutes its basis, that freedom from samsara cannot be attained through sacrifices, but through knowledge of religious truths and through the stifling of passions. At the basis of Buddhism lies the principle of victory over the caste system, not an actual but an ideal, fantastic victory. Accordingly, the injunction of poverty is established, the organization of religious beggary. This must be considered as reaction against the existing class differentiation, a reaction which naturally must have been very agreeable to the exploited levels of the population. Buddhism, like Christianity, did not persist in its original form. In the course of time and in consequence of its transplantation into different lands, it has undergone extraordinary changes. Buddhism qualifies as a world religion because, first, like Christianity, it raises itself above local and national ceremonial rites. Second, because it propounds a completely universal formula for the redemption of human wrongs, which is thus applicable to the most various social forms and classes, to exploiter as well as to the exploited, to slaves, free nomads, as well as to merchants. The most radical form of criticism of Brahmanism, a criticism which went beyond the bounds of religion, was ancient Indian materialism, of which I shall now speak. This ancient Indian materialism certainly existed in 500 BC, that is to say, simultaneously with Buddhism. In all probability, it existed even somewhat earlier than Buddhism. Unfortunately, this ancient Indian materialism is known to us only through statements of it made by opponents, the Brahmanist scholars, so that much of what was said about ancient Indian materialism is slander and misrepresentation. This ancient materialism was called Lokayata, derived from an old Indian word loka, meaning the secular world. It is thus the theory of laymen, as opposed to the theory of priests. The theory was also called Shekaraka, from sharv, to eat greedily. This is the name which the opponents of the doctrine gave to it. They wanted to describe it as a theory of men whose eating and drinking are their chief concern. These materialists directed an extremely sharp attack against the Brahmins. Their aim was to break the monopoly of the Brahmin priests and to establish complete religious freedom. As merchants, these materialists had a great interest in religious tolerance. I will briefly describe the main theories of this ancient Indian materialism. It maintained that the source of all knowledge is simply sensory experience. They did not recognize the authority of religious revelation, but neither did they recognize the course of reason, the drawing of conclusions from given experiences, as the source of knowledge. Only immediate sensory experience is the source of all knowledge. All spirituality arises, according to this conception, from the material, from the four elements which they had in common with the Greeks. Thought they considered as an activity of matter. Matter alone is knowable and real. There is no hereafter and no immortality of the soul. The priests, they say, are deceivers and buffoons who perform their sacrifices, their ceremonies, etc., in order to cheat the people and live on the sacrifices. These materialists were also opposed to the Buddhists. One of the basic doctrines of Buddhism is that all is sorrow and that all pleasures of the world are illusory, and had to that the materialists answer, it is absurd to condemn pleasures because they are mixed with sorrow and dissatisfaction. Man does not throw rice away because the kernel is wrapped in a rough shell. I will quote a few verses which present a concise summary of the theory of ancient Indian materialism. They run thus. There is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world. Nor do the actions of the four castes, orders, etc. produce any real effect. The Agnihotra, the three Vedas, the ascetics, 3 staves, and smearing one's self with ashes were made by nature as the livelihood of those destitute of knowledge and manliness. If a beast slain in the Jefusama rite will itself go to heaven, why then does not the sacrificer forthwith offer his own fodder? If the Srada produces gratification to the kings who are dead, then here, too, in the case of travelers, when they start, it is heedless to give provisions for the journey. If beings in heaven are gratified by our offering the Srada here, then why not give the food down below to those who are standing on the housetop? While life remains, let a man live happily. Let him feed on ghee, even though he runs in debt. When once the body becomes ashes, how can it ever return again? If he who departs from the body goes to another world, how is it that he comes not back again, restless for love of his kindred? Hence it is only as a means of livelihood that Brahmins have established here all these ceremonies for the dead. There is no other fruit anywhere. The 3 authors of the Vedas were buffoons, navs, and demons. All the well-known formula of the pundits, Jarpari, Tapari, etc. And all the obscene rites for the queen commanded in the Asvameda. These were invented by buffoons, and so all the various kinds of presents to the priests, while the eating of flesh was similarly commanded by night-prowling demons. With that, I leave these materialists. I might simply mention in conclusion that in ancient India there was an independent development of the theory of thought or logic. This theory was called Nyaya, that is, the theory of concepts, etc. This logic developed in ancient India as it did in ancient Greece, from discussions of various conflicting philosophical systems as a defensive technique, and these discussions as an aid to thought. This was one of the great achievements of ancient India.